Metal Gear Rising is an interesting game in many regards. Developed in conjunction between Platinum Games and Kojima Production, the game is an interesting mixture of the two styles of the teams working on it, having a more defensive approach to what we could call Platinum action, layered with arcadey stealth systems. This mixture reflects even in the story presentation and music choices, which as said creates a very peculiar mixture of a game. The game is set in the Metal Gear Solid 4 world 4 years later, but this time, instead of being a big Children of Men homage with a lot of exposition, it takes more from action and samurai films. And even if way shorter in length and word use, it actually implements in the narrative and gameplay some of the just touched upon elements of 4, even having a character picking fun at some of the writing of the series in a weird way.
Did you think every battle in history was all part of some big old conspiracy? Bullshit!
So in this video I'd like to concentrate my attention over the sometimes overlooked narrative of Metal Gear Rising, showcasing its characters and complexities. As said before, the tone and writing of the game showcases strongly the duality of writing styles of the developing teams, having action movie banter that sometimes includes lines that hide many layers of character which you can notice and understand with the context of a full story and repeated playthroughs, which are encouraged by the short length and the arcadiness of it, and not to be underestimated the common film inspirations of a team which usually blend in their own game's narratives. The codec conversations are also quite interesting at times, as they often reveal the cultural origins behind bosses and characters, discussions of radicalization of politics of Europe, talks of transhumanism and sociological issues, touristic spots, food and more. One issue I have in the way the codec conversations are presented is how they are contextualized within the gameplay. On the story aspect they're great, but the main problem with it is its original game structure, as Rising, opposed to the stealth Metal Gears, has less downtime and puzzle elements, while having more involved and fast-paced boss fights. So there isn't a lot of incentive to dig deep in the codec while you're playing for the first time, which is not all that bad as it enhances the thing I already said about the replay value. The game's story sees a PMC called Desperado and World Martian Incorporated as the antagonists, with them trying to destabilize countries to propagate the endless wars that fuel the American military-industrial complex, here represented by the PMCs. Belonging to these organizations are multiple cyborgs and other entities that during the story confront Raiden, and in a way reflects aspects of his personality and journey, and present him with their ideals, which Raiden assimilates in one way or the other. So from here on out, I'll be going over the main bosses, their origins, their ideology and whatnot, as human thinking bosses tend to be the most interesting characters in Platinum games. And this game is full of them, but all of this cannot start without our main character.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Returning from the ending of Metal Gear Solid 2, where he metaphorically rejects the player's control to become more of his own person instead of the player's avatar, Raiden is again the star of the game, and again the player's avatar. And anticipating some later points I'm going to cover, this game acts as a sort of case study of Raiden's character, as he is confronted by his hypocrisy and past, to then understand who he is better. An interesting point to talk about is relative to the ideal that he presents at the beginning of the game. This saying, which in the codec is attributed to its original author,
I really got into it. Started learning more and more about ancient Japan and the samurai code. I tore through stacks of books, movies, anything I could get my hands on.
Somehow hard to imagine you settling in with a big bucket of popcorn.
What? A cyborg can't have hobbies? I'll have you know I'm actually a huge movie buff.
Okay, okay. So that's where you picked up this Sword of Justice creed?
Yeah. Most of it from a single master named Munenori Yagyu.
in this case is actually taken from samurai films he watched. And in specific, it's one of the main thematics of Sanjuro, where a version of this ideal is passed by an old court lady to the nameless protagonist, in a manner not unlike how the bosses of a game will do. So one of the reasons why many of the bosses are irritated or just plainly mocking these ideals is relative to how much of a hypocrite fart it all sounds, just to justify manslaughter. So Bladewolf is an automated UG with a communication artificial intelligence that develops during the course of a game alongside them, and are also a reference to the Fahrenheit 451 machine hounds. They mirror Raiden's origin and arc during the story, as they're basically a child soldier who got extensive VR training, but when freed from their conditions, tried to develop ideals of their own. An interesting cinematic parallel during their sub-story would be with the 400 Blows by Francois Truffaut, where a child who is a prisoner of his social condition decides to break free and run away, only to be imprisoned once more, this time literally. The ending of a film could be what is referenced by Mistral in this bit.
So? What now? You think you will run to the coast? To freedom? Ha!
In which the main character, who just escaped his prison, finds himself running towards the beach, to then stop and be captured by a freeze frame of his face, in a famously enigmatic ending that symbolizes his confusion and aimless future. Mistral is one of the Winds of Destruction, which are basically the leaders of the PMC Desperado, from Algeria, which was colonized by France during the end of the Algerian Independence War, which is famous for France's use of torture, which was followed by the Algerian Civil War, where she lost her parents. Her character is heavily influenced by a novel by Albert Camus, The Stranger, which uses the Independence War to mirror the Civil War and her character with the protagonist of the novel. And yeah, this reference to the character of a previous conflict will be linked to the cyclical nature of war the game will expand upon later. She and Raiden both mirror each other in their origins, as both have a background relative to child warfare in Africa, after which they both found a figure that gave them direction in their life. To talk about a thing more relevant to a Japanese script of a game, which differs enough on certain extents and arguments, Mistral points out Raiden's Liberian origins, despite him looking Caucasian. This apparently made him gain the nickname White Devil, which is a Cantonese slang term to refer to Westerners, which is also considered an ethnic slur, which is relevant as he doesn't consider himself to belong to any culture or ethnicity.
I don't identify with anyone. No nation. No ethnic group. I'm my own man.
As said, this is addressed more in the Japanese version, which delves more into transhumanism and ethnicity, and makes cyborg enhancements as a sort of analogy for ethnic disparities.
I'm a cyborg, Courtney. What am I gonna do? Drive an ice cream truck? I can pass as normal from a distance, but up close, anyone can tell it's artificial skin. Good jobs aren't easy to come by these days, even for non-cyborgs, and I've got a family to feed. Besides, I've been fighting my whole life. It's just who I am.
I don't personally believe I have the authority or preparation to talk about this with confidence in any way, so I'll just move to a different character right now.
This is a stupid dope mix.
So Khamsin is a boss present only in the DLCs. He participated in the Desert Storm operation of the Gold 4, and he's based on the military man with a mecha in the James Cameron Avatar thing. I kind of got the idea that he was cut or scrapped from a game alongside his theme song, The Hot Wind Blowing, as he's pretty one-dimensional, which, considering how much other characters like Mistral treat him like a joke or a nuisance, it would seem so. If I were to find a place for him in the story, it would be around the Mexico chapter, where there isn't specifically a character boss, having instead the Grad. And considering his boss fight involves a lot of sneaking attacks, and the arena you fight the Grad is very built for that, I wouldn't exclude this. One reason it got changed, it probably was because they wanted to also change the focus of a conflict towards this science man and the danger the children are, and create anticipation for the next Winds of Destruction and the ascent toward Marshall, which involves our next character. Another member of the Winds of Destruction, Monsoon, is from Cambodia. where he lived in the capital city of Phnom Penh during the regime of the Khmer Rouge and the Killing Fields between 1975 and 1979. This is quite the heavy topic, but I'll try to explain it to the best of my ability. So, after the departure of the American military forces from the Vietnamese conflict, Cambodia was in the hands of the Khmer Rouge, who dedicated themselves to what they called purification of Cambodia, which meant the massacre of political oppositions and any person with a basic background of culture. To the point that even wearing glasses was considered as a sign of culture that had to be punished. Which, if you see the cyborg eyes implemented on Monsoon's face, could be a reference to that. And even the children and elderly were not exempt from this violence. Phnom Penh became a phantom city where most inhabitants who couldn't flee died of starvation, cold or lack of medical resources. The Khmer Rouge ultimately started to organize concentration and extermination camps. As I said before, I didn't have a preparation or deep research to talk about these extremely heavy topics, but all of this was meant to reflect on the private police force of Denver, that works as an overt reference to RoboCop or Minority Report, which are two films that seemingly influence heavily this game and the Metal Gear series in general. Most of the officers are repurposed mercenaries that needed jobs after the war recession, and they have emotional inhibitors to make them able to not think of the violence they perform, which can seem weird nowadays compared to how terrifyingly cartoonishly evil the real-world American police force can prove to act like. Monsoon, in his discussion about Richard Dawkins style memes, is making explicit some of the narrative themings of the game, as Raiden is being influenced and changed by all the enemies he's being confronted with, which slowly break down his ideals he got from Snake and the media he watched, losing what we could call a Pirandellian mask. Explaining it briefly, Luigi Pirandello was an Italian playwright who didn't like the archetypical nature of Italian theatre, usually referred as theatre of masks, where actors would put on masks of characters with set personalities and improvise on the base of a plot outline. In his stories, Pirandello would write of people who decided to abandon the metaphorical mask they use in interacting with other people in order to change their character, finding themselves in the trappings of a different personality. So what does the theories of this Italian playwright have to do with our cyborg action game? Actually quite a bit, as a lot of characters assume names and wear masks to fulfill their roles. And when Raiden's constructed self ultimately comes apart, he just reverts back to his previous role he knew best, which is his persona, and by doing so assuming his previous mask. This part of the game actually sometimes gets some mild critiques for building up Sam all the way up to the building to then have Monsoon coming out of nowhere, and also because the Ripper mode isn't very much discussed openly beyond this point a lot. And while having Monsoon in the town, building up to the building, creating this sort of propaganda Big Brother vibe would help a lot of introducing him, and also make his speech be sprinkled more along the way, the subsequent rise to the top of the building actually addresses Raiden's reassessment of himself, with him slowly calming down. But the problem with this is it's still relegated to the codex. And it culminates with a final talk with Bladewolf, where he is reminded that people are not a single personality, but they are an amalgamation of many, and he has to start accepting himself for what he is. Which brings us to our next encounter.
Royal Guard!
De facto leader of the Winds of Destruction,
He's from Alabama, unlike the wind he's named after, which is Californies.
even though he would seem like the farthest from Raiden in background, they're actually quite similar. Both came from poor economic positions and are recruited by the military. They share war crime nicknames based on their gory deeds.
Apparently the Sundowner handle comes from all the blood he leaves behind. Looks like the sunset.
Both are the face of their PMCs, and they even mirror dialogue at that point.
Maybe dream is the wrong word. They could kill some POWs, some civilians.
This training, you're the one doing the killing. Not just the soldiers, innocent people, POWs, civilians.
I see. So that is what the Sears program is.
Yeah. Look, I gotta move. Out.
Their main difference, though, could be that Raiden is learning to reconcile with his murderous tendencies, while Sundowner is fully embracing them. During his 9/11 speech, as said before, Sundowner basically mocks the ending of previous Metal Gears, presenting instead the narrative that violence and war are intrinsic to human nature, which will be expanded later. I haven't mentioned the music yet, which usually reflects aspects of the mentality or arc of the bosses. Sundowner's theme basically talks about his distorted jingoistic ideals that would see the destruction of the rest of the world as a sacrifice for his own country, which is a thing we'll go over later maybe.
Jetstream Sam. Now, don't be shy.
Brazilian practitioner of Satsujinkan, Samuel comes from a line of samurai emigrated to Brazil after the Second World War, which apparently wasn't such an uncommon thing. He now works as a bodyguard for Desperado. A lot of Samuel's characters and story is inspired by characters interpreted by Toshiro Mifune. The first one to come up will be Yojimbo. In this film, and even in its loosely defined sequels and in Seven Samurai 2, there's the main character that uses made up names to be identified as, which in Rising could connect to the loss of identity and ideals hinted by his theme song. In the film, he also infiltrates the antagonist's side as a bodyguard while secretly working to their detriment. His way of walking is also inspired from his stray wolf stance he did in the film, as called by director Akira Kurosawa, and his iconic drawing technique is also a reference to the one from the end of Sanjuro, where he's face to face with Tatsuya Nakadai's character. And I'm specifying the casting choice to make a point later, so I would ask you to keep it in mind, where in a single ascending strike he ends his opponent, who ends up emitting a fountain of blood, which is also referenced here. And here. One other feature reference from Yojimbo is the defeat of a gun by a sword user.
One story has Sam taking out a mafia hit squad, 10 men, all with assault rifles, using only his sword.
Not unheard of for a cyborg.
This was back in the early 2000s.
Come on. He did that without enhancements? And pre-SOP?
That's the story anyway. And he's a cyborg now, so he could only be stronger. Not to freak you out or anything.
Which in Yojimbo he does by injuring his opponent, who is performed by Nakadai again, on the wrist, as he does with Raiden, or as he gets hurt by Armstrong, who ruins his main arm with his nanomachine arm stump blade thing, which forces him to perform cyborg enhancements on his right arm, which now looks like the armor worn by another Toshiro Mifune character from Seven Samurai, Kikuchiyo, another character with an assigned name, who is killed by a one-eyed bandit who is decked in a full armor, and is also the one character who criticized the other main characters, and the figure of Samurai itself, in one of the most famous scenes of the film. Another couple of neat Kurosawa references can be seen in the motorcycle that Sam rides, which is similar to the one ridden by Toshiro Mifune in Scandal. And it's still Toshiro Mifune's character that is trying to make his family move to Brazil in fear of the H-bomb in the 1955 film I Live in Fear. I really like this character if you couldn't tell. So the encounter with Senator Armstrong is basically the climax of all the things we've discussed up until now. Having Armstrong and Raiden, who couldn't be from more different backgrounds and ideologies, fighting and stripping each other of Pirandello masks, until only their basic mutual desire for combat remains. The two characters, like all the others up until now, are actually more similar than one would think, as in different contexts, they both find themselves using tanks as a means of deterrence, for example.
Yes, well, security can mean many things.
And they also wear the same tie collar. At the end of the fight, Armstrong, now defeated, explains to Raiden about how, Even if he's dying, he has passed along his ideals to Raiden, like all the others who he met have done. And that, as the final battle theme song's text would suggest, you can read this as a sort of weird analogue to the hero's journey, as Raiden will never be the same person he was when he started this journey, but a new being that, if you want to read into the umbilical cord imagery in the last shot, will be born from a blood-stained sand.
You. And I.
We await your return, warrior.
The Metal Gear Rising ending is an interesting one, as it reflects elements from a 1966 film called Sword of Doom. The story of this film follows a samurai in his slow descent into madness, or if you were to believe the main character talks about his blade yearning for death, it's about him being consumed by a possessed sword and his bloodlust for revenge, which ultimately separates him from his wife and child. The protagonist of this film is interpreted by Tatsuya Nakadai, who, as I said before, fights Toshiro Mifune's characters on various occasions. These two actors and their characters could be seen as somehow intertwined, and in Sword of Doom they meet once more. In the film, Toshiro Mifune's character is a dojo master that, after seeing how the protagonist fights and acts, decides not to fight him yet, and leaves after talking to him about the meaning of his sword, with the idea that they would fight in the planned sequel. The film ends with the protagonist starting to hear and see the shadows of the people he has killed in a room full of screens, which makes him lose his mind, and in his rampage he kills a man who was organizing a coup d'etat, and then ends with him fighting a group of people. The film ends on a freeze frame like Once Upon a Time in America, or as cited before, The 400 Blows, where the uncertainty of the future of a boy is represented by a single imposed shot of his confused face. The interesting thing is that this wasn't the real intent behind this film, as Sword of Doom was supposed to be the first in a series of films adapting the over 40 novels of the series it was based upon. The thing is that the film didn't sell that well, so the studio cancelled the planned sequels, leaving the protagonist here, stuck in this moment, locked in a never-ending fight within his mind. In a way, by adapting the themes of these samurai films, Metal Gear Rising somehow fell victim to what we could ironically see as the curse of its predecessors. And in its ending, we see a world of never-ending conflict, where the future of the characters we've come to know will remain unknown to the player, who will now only be able to replay the game from start, never going forward, always reliving the same moments, where you fight people you've already killed, creating, by accident, a masterpiece of an ending.
I've got my own war to fight.
And this time without ripping off Evangelion. So thank you for following till the end, and it was supposed to be the second in a series of videos talking about the actual depth of Platinum Game stories, but I kind of wanted to do this one first, and I hoped you liked it. In general, I really like this game and discussions about it, and I could go on a bit more about some other elements within it, but I think that will be quite enough for today. But yeah, in general, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some insight on the narrative choices as I read them, and I hope to see you in another video I'll be making. So for now, bye!